Okay, so today's talk is going to be focused on Maori spirits, ancestors and Tapu in Mataku and Kaitangata Twitch. So first things first, I wanted to lay some foundations with regards to some of the theoretical material that I use. And one important term that is being revitalized by a number of scholars in religious studies is the term animism. So as a number of you are probably already familiar with, animism as a term was originally popularized in the Victorian period by Tyler. But in that period, it was very much used in order to talk about peoples who, although they were being studied in the present, were thought of as examples of the past. So in a sense, for Tyler, animism was a kind of a mistake. These people still believe in spirits. But now, in inverted commas, talking about his own time and the kind of scientific ideas that were around at the turn of the 19th century, Tyler was assuming that people were no longer animist and that they were going to become less and less animist as time went on. Now, a number of contemporary scholars, including in the anthropology of religion, have challenged Tyler's use of this term animism, Graham Harvey perhaps being one of the most famous, but have revitalized the term and used it in a different way. So instead of assuming that animist traditions are an ontological mistake, there is an emphasis on the ways in which they explore relationships, and in particular on the ways in which personhood is highlighted in these kind of relationships through an animist worldview. So this expands in many cases who are persons, and persons can include animal persons, in some cases tree persons, in some cases rocks, but they can also relate to various beings that are translated sometimes into English as spirits or mythological beings. Spirits and mythological beings, neither of those terms are a terribly good match for the indigenous terms, but just so that, in a sense, as an audience, we're all on the same page. It's this idea that instead these beings can be interacted with as persons. Now, one of the consequences of this kind of thinking is related to the way in which there is less of a sharp divide between religious objects and the spirits, ancestors, or deities that are represented by them. So there is a sense in which religious objects are not really objects at all. They are people. They are the incarnation, if you like, of the deity, rather than simply a representation of the deity. So one of the ways in which I've used some of these ideas is actually applied to contemporary film and television. And in that sense, I mean, my sense of contemporary is a lot longer than the average student. So I'm looking at things from the 1980s, for example. But I'm using that term and the term popular to kind of suggest that a lot of what I'm looking at is coming out of Hollywood or coming out of British TV. And in this case, what I've been able to do is explore things such as communicative dreaming and instances of possession. So, for example, in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, vampirism is understood as a form of demonic possession. And I've thought about that through the lens of contemporary animism. What are all of these things saying about personhood, even within what one might consider the contemporary West? However, the second part of this project, which is what I'm starting on now, is looking more closely at examples of contemporary animism that appear in Indigenous contexts, and in particular in Indigenous film. And one lovely example is the film Te Rua, 1991, which was directed by the Maori director Barry Barkley. Now, Barry Barkley is very interesting in and of himself. He's written quite a lot about the boundaries of Indigenous film. And what he is aiming to do in his films is not just tell Indigenous stories or use Indigenous actors and production teams, but actually, in terms of the decision-making process around making his films, he tries to apply Maori principles, and in particular, the principle of consultation. So rather than a kind of top-down film director's approach, he is thinking more in terms of a round table. Now, in this particular film, it's the fictional story of a battle by a tribe to get their ancestral carvings returned from a museum in Berlin. Interestingly, the carvings in this story are ancestors. And because of that, they are conceived as persons, and their theft is thought of as a kidnapping. In one scene, the carvings, still held in a Berlin basement building, are greeted in a ceremonial way by a Maori. And this scene is available on the website NZ on screen. So I haven't tried to show it to you today because of the technical issues, but if you're interested in the subject, it's an absolutely lovely scene. It's only about 5 minutes long, and it's a really beautiful illustration of what's going on here. Another nice touch to this film is that in the process of the negotiation of trying to get these carvings back, at one point, what the Maori group do is steal some statues of kind of Roman emperors, I think they are, and they steal these statues as if to say, well, you know, we're going to hold these guys hostage until you hand your hostages over. So it changes the whole dynamic from thinking about just things to realizing that, in a sense, when we're talking about Indigenous artifacts, we are in a way thinking about persons. And I think that reframes the debate in some very interesting and useful ways. So I wanted to talk very briefly to you about Indigenous futurism. And this is a label, if you like, that's been put together by the Ojibwe writer Dylan, who suggests that there are various elements that can be thought of in terms of Indigenous futurism when we're looking at, in particular, science fiction, but also other kinds of speculative drama produced and created by native peoples. And this might include ideas such as slipstream and also environmental sustainability, which is going to come up a little bit later in this talk. Now, the term Indigenous futurism, that it has been a little bit controversial because, although unintentional, you know, that's not the intention of it, but it can be have tinges, if you like, of a kind of futurism that was popular in Italy during the period where Italy was fascistic. So that's not the intention. It's just a kind of slip of the tongue. It's but some people have kind of been very wary of this term futurism because of that. The other thing is that we might automatically assume that if we're thinking about Indigenous futurism and if we're thinking about science fiction and fantasy, these stories are about imagined futures. And many of them are. But the examples that I'm going to look at today are actually reaffirming relationships and traditions in the past to help rebuild communities in the present. So although futurism is really interesting because it gets us to think about how different cultures might actually approach writing and might have different imaginative ways of conceiving the world that help to form part of their writing. At the same time, we can see how it's a term that is very much about the present and the past, as well as the future. So one of the first examples of this is a series called Mataku. It is currently available to watch on a very popular streaming platform. And the episodes in this series are set in the present, but they often have links to the past. And in particular, those links are through ancestral spirits and ghosts. When I use the term ancestors, they doesn't always mean ancestor in the way we might understand that in a European context. So an ancestor can be, in some contexts, about one's grandfather's grandfather, etc., etc. But the term ancestor is also used in terms of kind of figures that perhaps in English we would be more familiar with, the idea of mythological spirit, guardian figure, etc., etc. But nonetheless, the term ancestor fits because there's an idea that these figures are closely related to the tribe. So again, we have this idea of relationship, but they're not necessarily ancestors in the sense of a direct bloodline. These figures are also connected to the future as Maori characters try to repair their relationships, both within their communities and in the environment. And there are various episodes that do this. One of the things that comes up in the series is the word tapu, and it's used to indicate the dangers of disrespecting those relationships. So there's a particular example in one early episode in which a ritual club that is protected by a guardian spirit who attacks those who try to steal this club for personal gain. A young Maori man tries to cheat his people by giving a copy of this club to his community and selling the original to a foreign buyer. But the deaths of his business partner and the buyer remind the young man and the audience of the dangers of ignoring taboo. And we actually see scenes in which there's this guardian spirit which kind of comes out of the club and attacks people. So it's one way in which a kind of imaginative representation can reincarnate, if you like, these traditional ideas. We do need to be a little bit careful because the word taboo has entered common parlance and also our academic parlance through scholars such as Durkheim, who were inspired by the original term tapu to theorize more broadly about what has been translated into English as taboo, and about the ways in which taboo maintains barriers between sacred and profane. But an article such as that by Matara offers much more precise analysis of the term in a Maori context. And I would say that, again, if we pay attention to relationships and to respect, so rather than seeing it as this kind of impersonal force that separates the sacred and the profane, it's more about a way of maintaining this living chain of relationships and that kind of a respect for those relationships, which then have these consequences in terms of behaviours. So I was speaking about the ways in which these kinds of series can give us a visual representation of stories that might have previously circulated through oral storytelling, for example. And I was looking at this idea in particular in an edited collection called Religion and Sight, so my particular paper for that collection. was looking at the ways in which film, as a visual and a partly oral medium, is translating these ideas. And I was examining in particular spirits, but also ghosts. So there's quite a lot of work on ghosts in that paper. And some of what I'm talking about today is based on that paper. So what are the issues here? What are the pros and cons of Indigenous film as compared to oral storytelling? Well, one of the things it can do is it can actually represent visually things which can't be caught with the naked eye. So we can't see people's dreams unless they're ours. We can't necessarily capture altered states of consciousness on camera. So if we wanted to make a documentary, we could capture people's facial expressions when they're in an altered state of consciousness, but we can't capture what that person is experiencing. And similarly, although there's been all kinds of stuff where people have tried to capture images of ghosts on camera, nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that the portrayals of ghosts and spirits in kind of fictional film are, how can I put this? They relate the emotional experience and ways in which people experience these kinds of sightings in ways in which a documentary film that's just kind of stood there while people are experiencing a ghost might not necessarily be able to do. However, this medium does have limitations and problems, particularly when you compare it to oral storytelling. So oral storytelling has a social context. The story is told now because it's relevant to people in the present and to current events. So to give just one example, somebody in the tribal group might be being a bit naughty. And rather than having a massive telling off, you know, there might be a little telling off, but rather than a massive telling off and kind of making somebody feel ashamed and all of that kind of stuff, what often occurs is that storytelling is used to kind of illustrate why a piece of behavior is not what is expected within that particular group. And so you will quite often have trickster stories, for example, of characters who are naughty and get themselves in a pickle through being greedy or being silly or being selfish. And, you know, children can laugh at these stories and at the same time think, yeah, perhaps that was a bit daft. And so it's a form of education, among other things, but it means that it is given at that moment. Whereas obviously once you film something, the film is a permanent thing. And so it's not necessarily as responsive to the moment as an oral storytelling tradition. The other problem is related to place. So quite often within traditions of oral storytelling, somebody is actually taken to a place in which mythological events or sacred events are thought to have happened or be happening, depending on the way that you look at it. And the young person might, for example, in Aboriginal Australia, be shown a rock that a certain dreaming being has sat down in or is sitting down in, and you can see the bottom print in the rock. So it's quite a sensual experience, and it's an experience where somebody is learning about the land in the context of what rights and responsibilities that person may have towards the land, because those rights and responsibilities are not necessarily the same for every tribal group or every tribal subgroup or every member. And so it is a very particular kind of experience. And in that sense, it's very difficult to replicate that by film, precisely because film can be shown almost in any time and place, particularly nowadays with computers. So how do people get around this? And I've given a couple of examples here from Native America, because they kind of illustrate the point. So there's a lovely film called Dreamkeeper, again available on the same popular streaming platform, that you've got a story where a young man is kind of running a little bit amok, you know, a little bit naughty, and he doesn't really want to take his grandfather to the powwow, but his mum pushes him into it, and so he ends up going on this road journey with his grandfather, who you've got the actual story of what's happened to this young man and his grandfather, and at the same time you've got all of these other stories that the grandfather tells to kind of illustrate again where the lad might be going wrong, where perhaps he needs to look at something in a different way. And so it's kind of a story interspersed with all of these other stories. And again, animation is a really good way of signifying the within the story part of things, and can illustrate happenings and beings that might be quite hard to illustrate in kind of live action. So the second example I've got here is Mac of the Spirits, where at the beginning, it's a short film. You can find it on the National Film Board of Canada if you're interested. And you've got a chap telling a story, and you see him with young people sitting around, and he's banging a drum, so you know that this is story time. And then the film goes into animation, where this young man meets a spirit, and then right at the end of the storytelling session, we go back to the live action with the man banging the drum. And so that's a way of enabling us to move between worlds and seeing what's happening within the story, but also the awareness that this is a storytelling time. So it's kind of creating that sacred space for the viewer of the film. So the other example that I wanted to have a look at, and this is another Maori example, is called Kaitangata Twitch. And this is a New Zealand TV series directed by Yvonne McKay and adapted from a novel by Margaret Mahay. And it combines debates about Maori traditions and the environment with depictions of both spirits and ghosts. So the story focuses on a New Zealand family who live on a beautiful bay with an island called Kaitangata. It focuses on 12-year-old Meredith Gallagher, who has Maori heritage from her mother Grace. And she seems to have a strange connection to this island. When she plays her flute, the rocks on the island respond. Yeah, they seem to kind of grow bigger as she looks at them and she's playing. And she has strange dreams. So again, we've got this idea of the island, which perhaps in some Western conceptions might be seen as kind of a thing, perhaps a very beautiful part of the environment, but nonetheless not necessarily a person. In this account, the island is like a living being who is developing a relationship with Meredith. And there's a Maori elder, Lee Carr, who at first tries to discourage Meredith from the island. And he suggests that the island is sacred, but at the same time it is dangerous. And I think this is where this kind of idea of tapu comes in again. And he evokes the kind of agency, if you like, of the island by suggesting that it is the island that is trying to catch her in its dreams. So it's no longer her dreams, it's the island's dreams that she's somehow getting drawn into. Now, at the same time all of this is going on, the family as a whole, she's got a brother and a sister, are trying to oppose the developer's plans for environmental reasons. And it's quite interesting because they depict the developer as a Maori. And he is an ambivalent figure in the story. He is not necessarily the baddie. He might be misguided, but he speaks Maori. He's proud of his heritage. but he feels that developing the island is the best way forward. And so it's quite a subtle and sensitive examination of different people's points of view with regards to these issues. Now, in the climax of the story, we have the idea that the island itself has become fused with an ancestral spirit. And this mixes up the idea of a guardian spirit with the idea of cannibal spirits. And this is depicted really quite beautifully, as you can see in this picture, where you have a cave, but there's actually the cave is a person. It is also this cannibal spirit. And so there's a kind of a real sense of animism here, as the island both has agency and controls dreams. And there's a section where it opens up to swallow Meredith's blood. So what you have, eventually the story does resolve itself, and there's kind of peace made between the two different sides. And in addition to what's going on with the cannibal spirit, you also have a ghost that's related to a love story from 50 years ago. So there's the combination of the two things in this series. There's the ancestral spirit, but there's also a ghost. And the ghost is a young girl named Shelley, who was actually stepping out, if you like, with the young Lee Carr. And Lee Carr was blamed when this young girl disappeared, because nobody realized that it was actually the ancestral spirit who had swallowed her up. So as the story kind of reaches a conclusion, people realize what had happened in the past, and there's that kind of resolution with the ghost. And there is also a kind of calming of the spirit. So there's a sense in which people begin to understand that when people are starting to try and develop on this island, they're kind of hammering things into the island, and the island is feeling pain. And so there has to be this kind of coming to terms where there's a recognition on both sides. So the island stops being threatening, but at the same time, people stop threatening the island with development. And the character of Sebastian Caldwell, the developer, is redeemed because he rescues a young person and he can see what is actually going on. And so he kind of changes his ways. So I think it's quite interesting because it's trying to, well, not only depict these spirits, but it's also depicting the ways in which relationships can be reformed and reknitted together in the present to try and resolve issues to do with the past. And if that's okay, I'll stop there.